You're stronger than people think. You've got this. You can do it. You have shoulders made of ivory. We all do, because we've done the work, because we've been training, because we've been watching videos. We've been working up till this moment, and now it's here, and we're ready to do it. I learn by stories. I think most people do. They learn by stories. That's why when I write my books, I've written now 12 books. They've sold almost 5 million copies in 30 plus languages. But I think the reason my books have worked is the reason that all my favorite books have worked, which is that they're rooted in stories. There's a reason that Jesus speaks in parables. There's a reason that all our monomyths sort of follow the same arc, the same trajectory, what they call the hero's journeys. Stories are how we remember, and they're how we learn. And I think Stoicism is no exception. I'm Ryan Holiday. As I said, I've written these books about Stoicism. I've also spoken all over the world to special forces operators and sitting senators, the NFL, the NBA, every group you can imagine. And when I get up on stage, what I do is I tell stories. I tell stories that illustrate the ideas of Stoicism. And so in today's episode, I want to give you some of my favorite Stoic stories boiled down to their essence. Stories that you're going to remember, stories that illustrate big ideas but bring them down to a practical, applicable level. And so here we go, some Stoic stories to inspire you, inform you, and hopefully guide you to who you're capable of being. One of the best stories in all of Stoicism comes at the founding of Stoicism. Zeno, he's this successful merchant. He comes from a long family of merchants, and he suffers a shipwreck and he loses everything. He washes up in Athens, he has nothing, and there he discovers philosophy. That's how Stoicism starts. And so reflecting on this journey, this thing that he never would have wished happening, changing the entire course of his life and now history, we wouldn't be talking had he not gone through this. He says, I made a prosperous voyage when I suffered a shipwreck, meaning the worst thing that ever happened to him was actually the best thing that ever happened to him. And that's what a Stoic says. We don't control what happens. Bad stuff is going to happen, but we control how we respond to it. We control what we turn it into. And whatever it is, whatever metaphorical shipwreck you're going through, you can make it a prosperous voyage if you think about it that way. There's an amazing story about Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22 and Slaughterhouse-Five. They're at the party of this billionaire. And Vonnegut is teasing Heller, and he says, this billionaire whose house we're at, he made more money this week than your book will make it its entire life. And Heller says, but I have something that he doesn't have. Vonnegut says, what's that? And Heller says, I have some idea of what enough is. He says, I have enough. This idea of enough is so powerful. Seneca, who quotes Epicurus, says, if you don't regard what you have as enough, you will never be happy, even if you rule the entire world, right? Enough is never enough, the Epicureans and the Stoics say, for the person who enough is too little. And if you can get to a place of enough, what I have is good, everything else is extra, then everything you get is a bonus, and the rest of your life is amazing. But if you tell yourself you'll only be happy if I'll feel better when, you'll never get there. The finish line will move, I promise you. Enough is enough. There's an amazing story about Marcus Aurelius. He didn't want to be emperor. In fact, when he's given the news that he's to be adopted by the Emperor Hadrian, he weeps because he thinks of all the bad kings of history. So Marcus was scared. Maybe he had a little bit of imposter syndrome like you and I have. But the night before he's to ascend the throne, Marcus Aurelius has a dream. And in the dream, he feels that his shoulders are made of ivory. And that's how he knows. He knows he's strong enough to bear the weight. He can carry the load. He can do this. And you have to know, you have shoulders of ivory too. You're stronger than you know. You're stronger than people think. You've got this. You can do it. You have shoulders made of ivory. We all do, because we've done the work, because we've been training, because we've been watching videos. We've been working up till this moment, and now it's here, and we're ready to do it. People don't know this, but John F. Kennedy very nearly lost the 1960 presidential election. In fact, he won by only about a half a percentage point, and in the end, it came down to about 35,000 votes. So what happened? Martin Luther King was arrested right before the election on trumped up charges and sentenced to 4 months on a prison chain gang. And his wife was actually very worried that he would be lynched or murdered in prison. And so she called both the Nixon campaign and the Kennedy campaign. Nixon, who was actually friends with Martin Luther King, decided not to get involved. He didn't want to piss off Southern voters. John F. Kennedy called the judge, called Coretta Scott King, and his brother also worked to get Martin Luther King released. And Martin Luther King would say after that he was stunned by this because Nixon had been his friend. And he said, I always regarded Nixon as a moral coward after that. And it was the news of this that rallied the black community to vote for John F. Kennedy in the election and won him. So it's really just a few seconds of courage that win Kennedy the election and lose Nixon the election. And I talk about this in Courage is Calling. We think bravery is this big thing, but it's really a very small thing. It's an immediate thing. It was a call to Martin Luther King's wife. It was a call to a judge. It was the decision to get involved, to ignore the reservations. Marcus Aurelius says, just that you do the right thing, the rest doesn't matter. You do the right thing, and you trust that doing the right thing will pay off. You also trust in your ability to survive, even if people don't appreciate that you did the right thing. And courage is always better than cowardice. There was a Spartan general who's marching through Greece, and as he would come to each nation, he would send emissaries to say, friend or foe, are you going to let us march peacefully, or are we going to need to treat this as hostile territory? Almost all of the answers came back, friend, friend, friend. But one king hesitated, and he wanted more time to think about it, and he kept deliberating, and he wouldn't come back with an answer. And finally, the Spartan king said, let him keep thinking about it. We'll keep marching on. Emerson said, you cannot spend the day in deliberation. George Marshall said, don't fight the problem, decide the problem, right? You have to have the courage to decide, to make the decision, to make your choice, and then to get moving on the most important part, which is execution. Courage is calling. Make your decision, decide what you're going to do, and then what? The Stoics say, do it. Do it as if it's the last thing you're doing in your life. Do it as if you're fully committed to it, because you are fully committed to it and you know how much it matters, because you made the decision. So Thomas Edison he's America's most successful inventor. He's sitting down for dinner with his family, and a man rushes in. The factory is on fire, and Edison shows up on the scene and he sees it, his life's work up in flames. His son is standing there shell-shocked, and what does Edison say? Edison says, go get your mother and all her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again. And some people thought he lost his mind, but he actually goes on to repeat a line from a Kipling poem about triumph and disaster, treating these two imposters just the same. What Edison is realizing, as a Stoic does, is that some things are just out of our control. We can't change them. No amount of whining or complaining or weeping is going to affect them, but we can control how we respond. And that's what Edison does. He tells a reporter the next day, I've been through stuff like this before. He says, it prevents an old man from getting bored. And he starts rebuilding. He actually takes $1 million loan from Henry Ford. In 6 weeks, it's partially back up and running. In 6 months, it's fully operational. And the third act of Edison's life is rebuilding after this disaster. And I want you to think about that as well. That's the idea, that you'll never see something like this again. You can at least enjoy the absurdity, the surreal beauty of it. And then you can say, this prevents me from getting bored. Now I'm going to get back to work and I'm going to turn this into something. There's this amazing story about Ulysses S. Grant. He goes to West Point as a young man. He's this promising young military officer. He serves honorably in the Mexican-American War. But then something goes wrong. Maybe it's the drink, maybe he hates the army, but he basically ends up working for his dad, selling firewood by the side of the road. This is a big fall, from West Point to selling firewood by the side of the road. And one of his old friends from West Point comes by one day, who's still in the army, well on his way, moving his way up through the ranks, and he's ashamed to see his friend doing this. And he says, good God, Grant, what are you doing? And Ulysses S. Grant just looks at him and he says, I'm solving the problem of poverty. Meaning that Grant doesn't care that he's doing a so-called menial job or that it's a humiliating occupation. All he cares about is that he's providing for his family, he's doing a good job. It's crazy to think that just a few years later, Grant would be the head of an enormous army, and a few years after that, he'd be the president of the United States. But for the Stoic, there's this idea that comes from Marcus Aurelius. He says, to accept it without arrogance, to let it go with indifference. Meaning, you don't let the lowly position change who you are, and you don't let the high position change who you are either. None of it goes to your head. You know, none of it says anything about you as a person, because you know who you are as a person, and that's what really matters. If you want to learn more about Stoic philosophy totally for free, you can sign up for our daily Stoic email. It's one free email every morning, the best of Stoic wisdom, dailystoic.com/email.